Welcome back to the video lecture on ASEAN state practice in the domestic implementation of international law. This time, we are going to have the overall observations in each specific issues we discussed before. The first, the ocean and territory and environment. Based on the lecture which I have done so far, to address the primary questions as to whether there is an ASEAN approach to international law that is distinct from the international law that was derived from the West, it does not appear that there is a unique perspective to international law that emanates from Asia as a whole. What can be observed at this juncture is that there are international legal issues in areas such as the environment and human rights that looked unique to part of the Asia on account of the shared and extensive history which existed between the civilizations, societies, and communities, and commonalities in the political and social cultural of some ASEAN states that is reflected in the matter in which government power is exercised and the importance of social hierarchy. At least on the surface, there appears to be similarities in the ways that ASEAN states have approached international legal issues within their jurisdictions. In other areas, such oceans and territory, and trade and investments, ASEAN states have been active in application of legal principles to these matters. It is less clear that there is a particular ASEAN approach. The challenges toward isolating an ASEAN approach to international law is the presence of other factors that are not necessarily region-specific, such as the economic and or geopolitical circumstances of a particular country or a group of countries that can also provide a compelling explanations of its uses of international law, not to mention the domestic forces present in a specific country that can affect the application and implementation of international law. Searching for ASEAN region-specific approach to international law will need to address these important considerations before a conclusion can be made. We began with the hypothesis that there might exist within Asia a regional approach to practice of international law that is distinct, or at least distinguishable, from that of other states, especially in Europe and Americas. Based on the research undertaken thus far, the following observations have been made. First, in the case of the ocean and territory, ASEAN states have been active in the negotiation and making of the primary treaty governing the law of the sea, UNCLOS, and most of them have signed or acceded to and ratified this treaty. However, UNCLOS does not concern itself with territorial disputes, although it may rule on the matter tangentially, where other UNCLOS-related matters arise, such as the Indo-South China Sea arbitration between the Philippines and China. Territorial disputes and claims in Asia have nevertheless been subject to third-party adjudication, most notably in a case involving the Temple of Priya case in the island of Spada and Litan and Petra Branca in the Bay of Bengal. However, of the remaining disputes highlighted above, ASEAN states appear to be much less prepared to submit to third-party adjudication, largely due to the high political investment and national pride in a dispute concerned. As I mentioned before, the formal dispute resolution mechanisms have not been initiated for the dispute in Northeast Asia. In particular, China has emphasized its preference to resolve dispute by dialogue rather than compulsory binding third-party resolution. In some cases, ASEAN states have also demonstrated the considerable capacity to settle maritime boundary dispute and jurisdictional issues peacefully, including by all cooperation. In dispute concerning joint development initiative, ASEAN states have shown a willingness to temporarily set aside maritime boundary disputes in working out practical solutions through the development of the joint development areas. Finally, with respect to innocent passage regimes, ASEAN state is divided. The majority ASEAN state would right add various conditions for foreign warships exercising rights of innocent passage in their territorial seas. Let me touch upon the environment issues. The first, for treaty-based environmental regimes, especially those related to trade, such as CITES and the Basel Treaty Amendment on plastic waste, ASEAN states appear to prepare mainly informal regional arrangement to facilitate the domestic or municipal implementation of their treaty obligations. As observed above, the several geopolitical coalitions and partnerships have been established to support the protection of regional biodiversity and the plastic waste management. The possible reasons for the formation of these regional and sub-regional fora to facilitate the national implementation of the International Environmental Treaty obligation include the first, notions of regional solidarity to develop or maintain a common position in the negotiation for international rules, and B, the ensuring compatibility of implementation between neighboring states within a region or sub-region through the development of common standards to ensure the smooth implementation across different domestic markets and thereby maintain market competitive positions in relation to regional and sub-regional trading partners. The emphasis on building regional coalitions to support implementation of international obligation may also be product of ASEAN interpretation of the consent, common but a differentiated responsibility. However, all these hypotheses and propositions remain to be fully tested and proven or falsified by further empirical examination of the implementation of environmental treaty-based obligations within ASEAN national legal systems. The second, subsection on recognition of human and natural environmental rights within individual ASEAN national legal systems evinces a combination of modernity through the utilization of the post-independent legal systems, usually becast by former colonial powers, along with the attempt to reconnect to traditional pre-colonial notions of harmony and synergy between humankind and nature, including acceptance of cultural and even spiritual connections between local communities and significant natural objects such as rivers, mountains, forests, and jungles. The culmination of such recognition of the human-nature relations is manifest in the following ways. For example, the inclusion of substantive and procedural environmental rights within ASEAN national constitutions, law, and adjudicatory jurisprudence, and B, the reform of the ASEAN legal system to inculcate the better environmental awareness, for example, through establishment of the environmental court and tribunals, and even the provision of legal personality and standing for natural environment objects to enhance their protection from degradations. The third, the subsection of climate change litigation is arguably indicative of the possibility of the transplantation of the new legal imperatives, such as state and corporate responsibility for real climate change mitigation action from mainly Western and especially European legal system to that of the ASEAN legal system, especially the China inner context. Here, as in the subsection on environmental rights, for example, in modernity, in the form of the post-colonial, Western-based or Western-inspired legal systems, afford the concrete legal avenues to realize both into nascent cultural, spiritual connections with the natural environment, as well as new or encompassing environmental challenges in the form of the present and current climate change crisis or emergency. The main differences between the Western and especially European and ASEAN legal systems in relation to their implementation of international environmental obligations appear to be that Western European legal systems are fully wedded to the modern rationalist conception of the logic and order, wherein environmental considerations are progressively recognized and included for legal protection, mainly on the basis of the scientific acceptance of the impact of the human activities on the natural environment. Whereas ASEAN legal systems appear to be utilizing modern legal systems, concepts and procedures to reconnect ASEAN societies with the pre-modern, pre-colonial past, which venerated the natural environment as the ultimate source of all life on Earth. While this is not to say that Western conceptions of the environmental protection by law do not pay attention to pre-modern cultural connections with nature, it appears that Western jurisprudence on this subject adopt a rationalist rather than naturalist or even humanist perspective, whereas ASEAN jurisprudence on these matters are more comfortable in drawing from the historical, pre-modern, pre-colonial past, wherein the human-nature connections are ascendant. The general pluralism accepted and arguably even advocated by current the international law suggests that the international both appreciate and uphold the different approaches to the domestic implementation of international environmental obligation within Western and Asian countries, subject of course to be the constraint imposed by rules or the treaty interpretation and principle of good faith, which as a recognized general principle of international law applies equally to all states across the world. From a formal and institutional perspective, ASEAN implementation of international environmental obligations within existing national legal systems largely follow westernized the precepts of a rule of law-based systems that were usually imposed in ASEAN jurisdictions during the colonial era, but then subsequently internalized post-independence through national constitutions and domestic legal systems based on those imposed on these ASEAN politics during the colonial period. In this sense, there is a little difference, the formalistically speaking, between Western and ASEAN the implementation of their respective international environmental obligations. In ASEAN, it is usually not possible to initiate legal proceedings and base a claim directly on international human rights law. However, by strategically selecting and creatively interpreting and applying domestic administrative law and regulations, the claimants sometimes manage to achieve more or less the same result as their human rights counterparts in Europe. In conclusion, the distinctive Asian approach to domestic implementation of international environmental obligations resolve around A, establishment a regional sub-regional consensus, and B, a greater willingness in certain regions in Asia to draw on their historical, cultural, and philosophical, and even spiritual the antecedents that venerate the human nature connection to both justify and buttress acceptance of the primacy of environmental considerations in the ongoing socio-economic developments of their economies. Thank you very much for your kind attention.